Alright, so I got 4 reviews for you guys today. I am doing that because I've been falling a little bit behind with them. I'm seeing a lot of movies and I want to just try and get my thoughts out on as many of them as possible in as little time as possible. With that, let's just get right to it. Here are timestamps for you for each individual review. It Comes at Night is written and directed by Trey Edward Schultz, and the setup for this movie is there is a family living in a house and a stranger stumbles upon this house, and that's all I'm going to say about it because I knew almost nothing going into this movie. All I saw was the poster, and I thought that it was an extremely intriguing poster, one of the best posters of the year, and I wanted to know more about it. And so I watched the movie, and oh boy, there's a lot that happens in this movie that I found to be extremely interesting, and that's why I'm not giving anything away. I think that all of the performances in this movie are terrific, especially Joel Edgerton and Kevin Harrison Jr., who play father and son in this movie. They're the family who's living at the house. Since it is an isolated house, and so it is an isolated setting. There's only so much that can happen within an isolated setting, but this movie makes such a good use out of it, and it is able to be extremely suspenseful, very tense throughout certain scenes. The director was able to use negative space in this movie to such an effect that it really, it just worked so well. And going off on the director, he did such a good job with this movie. This was his vision for what he wanted out of this project, and I think that he did an extremely great job of being able to get everything that it seemed like he wanted out of this movie. This is a very tightly directed movie. Everything just seems like it has a place in this movie, and it is very effective, the direction in this movie. Also very effective was the cinematography, and the way that the cinematography was used to add to tension in the scenes and to add to moments of levity, especially near the end. I thought I started noticing it, but there are a few minor problems that I had with this movie. One of them was that the characters could have been more fleshed out. There's nothing particularly interesting about any one of them except for the situation that they're in and the way that they choose to deal with those circumstances. We're just not given a lot of background on who they were before all of this started happening, and I think that it would have certainly been interesting to know who they were. It would have added an interesting contrast to who they might have been as opposed to who they are now. I think that could have been an interesting layer added to the movie. It's not necessarily, it doesn't take away from the movie that it does not have this element to it, but I think that it could have added to it had it been there. And there were also a few minor things that were left unresolved, but these things were these are plot elements that were brought up but were never came full circle, never had any sort of resolution. The only reason that I bring this up is because some of these were very interesting plot points. There was something to do with a character's brother that I thought was a very interesting detail added to the movie, and I thought that had it been played out, it would have added another layer of suspense, but it's dropped, which is a shame, and there's a couple other things that are like that, but that was the most prominent one that stood out to me. There are dream sequences in this movie, and these dream sequences have a different aspect ratio than the rest of the movie. The aspect ratio are the black bars that you see on the top and bottom, and the aspect ratio changes during these dream scenes. Not everyone is going to notice this, but me looking into like each frame to see how it's composited, I noticed this. And this does take away some of the suspense because you know that the events happening aren't real and have no real consequences to them. But what I thought that these scenes were very effective. They would have been more effective had they not had the change of aspect ratio, because it would have left more of a mystery to the movie of whether or not certain characters were going insane or certain events were happening. It would have been better, I think, if that had not changed throughout the movie. Also, at the very end of the movie, the ratio changes, so there are a total of 3 different ratios in this movie. I believe it's 235, 245, and 3. I could be wrong, but I know that at the end it is a 3-to-1 ratio, and that I thought was effective because it showed the world collapsing on these characters. Very, very good uh, for the end, although I didn't like it in the beginning. I would say that It Comes at Night is a 17 out of 20. That's the rating I would give it. Very good. I would check it out. This is going to be a polarizing movie, though. I think that there are going to be some people who watch this and really don't like it. But that's kind of the movie this is. If you have seen this movie, let me know what you think, because I'm very interested in what other people think of this movie. I happen to really enjoy it. I loved it. But I understand where not everyone would. Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri is written and directed by Martin McDonough and stars Frances McDormand as a woman whose daughter was raped and killed, and the police have yet to find her killer. And this takes place 6 months after the murder happened, and she puts up these billboards on a street calling out the chief of police in the town, who's played by Woody Harrelson. The trailers made this appear as though it was sort of a one-note concept without too much depth with it, or at least not too much depth within its own story. But I was really interested in the direction that this movie went. One thing that I've actually found very surprising was that it was able to be very, very funny. The writing in this movie is extremely good. One of the best, I would say one of the best screenplays of the year. Just because of it feels so different from everything else that I've seen this year. And sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's a bad thing. So maybe it's not the best of the year or one of the best, but it certainly is one of the more standout-ish screenplays of the year. It's, like I said, it's able to be very funny, but this is heavy subject matter, so it needs to be sad in some parts also, which it did pull off. It was able to do both of these moments very well, although sometimes they didn't exactly blend together very naturally. There is one particular moment where I found it to be very jarring, and this was in an interrogation scene involving Woody Harrelson and Frances McDormand's character. It was funny, and I was really enjoying watching it, but then something happens, and it completely shifts tones to a much bleaker and darker subject. And both of these tones individually were able to work so well that I didn't mind that it was a jarring transition, but it was still an extremely jarring transition. So that is a bit of a problem, but not too much, just because both of the elements individually worked so well. If one of them was lacking a bit, then this would be a much bigger problem. But this movie ended up being quite interesting. I was very invested in the story that was happening, and even though the main character, she's a complete asshole to everybody, she's still portrayed to be likable, and I found myself rooting for her throughout this entire movie, which is very impressive. And I also think that, along with Frances McDormand, the entire cast was able to give a very good performance in this movie. She's obviously the standout, and I think that she's going to be getting some awards buzz for her performance in this movie. Also, someone who did very well that stood out in my mind was Sam Rockwell. He plays a racist police officer in this movie, and he plays a much bigger role than I expected, actually. At least from his first scene, I expected him to be more of a background character. But his arc was my favorite arc of the entire movie. Yeah, this movie, it caught me off guard in the ways that I enjoyed it. I didn't expect to enjoy it in the way that I did. I expected this to be a more straightforward story, but this takes directions that I don't normally see movies take. And so I definitely commend it for that. Even though it doesn't work all the time, it tries something different, and I really appreciate it for that. I would give Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri a 16 out of 20. This is definitely one of the better movies of the year. I would recommend checking it out. I think that this movie will definitely not be as polarizing as It Comes at Night was. There might be some people who find it to be too vulgar, because this is a very vulgar movie. But I found myself enjoying this movie very, very much. And I would recommend it to anyone who's interested in this kind of story. I think that you would all really enjoy it. And Last Flag Flying is the third movie that I saw, and that is written and directed by Richard Linklater. I don't really watch too many of his movies. I've only seen Boyhood, that I might have seen another one. I don't really remember. I remember liking Boyhood. I thought it would be better, but it is a really good representation of what life feels like. So I commend that movie for that. And so I had a certain expectation for this movie. I didn't see any advertisement for this. I just saw the cast, which is Bryan Cranston, Steve Carell, and Lawrence Fishburne. And I saw that this was a Richard Linklater movie. And I thought that it might be worth checking out. And it absolutely was. And this is one of my favorite movies of the year, and that's for multiple different reasons. One of those reasons are the performances in this movie. They are all fantastic. I think that this is the best ensemble cast of the year so far. I haven't seen every movie yet, but this will be in contention for one of the best casts of the year. I think that everybody in here does an excellent job with the material that they're given, which is also excellent, but I'll get into that in a sec. The best performance in this movie is Bryan Cranston, and I think that he completely disappears into the role, and I think that he gives his best performance to date. The only reason that I'm hesitant on that is because he was so good as Walter White in Breaking Bad that it's hard to top that, but he does such a good job in here that I think he might have done a better job, but I just don't know. It's quite possibly the best performance of the year, other than maybe Jake Gyllenhaal for Stronger, and maybe Daniel Kaluuya for Get Out. In terms of all the male performances this year, he's just fantastic. And Steve Carell also has a couple of really great moments in this movie. He does a great job. It's because he doesn't do as good of a job just because his character is slightly less prominent, or at least slightly less flashy than Bryan Cranston's character is. Because the premise of this movie is that Steve Carell's son was in the Marines and he was killed. And so he tracks down two of his former Vietnam buddies, and he asks them to accompany him to Arlington to bury his son. And so he is grief-stricken throughout this entire movie, and he pulls it off fantastically. And there's also a couple of moments of just emotional levity for him that I think that he does so well that it's one of the better performances of the year. This is the best performance I've ever seen from Carell. This cast is just so good, and Lawrence Fishburne is in this as well. He plays a pastor who accompanies Carell on his journey. Cranston plays a bartender, and all of these guys used to serve in Vietnam together, and it's just such a good story. And this is where the writing comes in. The writing is just fantastic. All of the characters feel very real, and the conversations that they have with one another, it feels like I'm just watching these group of people hang out. They're real people, and I'm watching them interact with each other. Because the writing is so good, the direction is quite excellent as well. And it's not a flashy directed movie. There's nothing that you really notice that, there's nothing to the caliber of Jordan Peele for Get Out in this movie, but it's extremely well directed because Richard Linklater was able to make me laugh. He was able to make me feel for these characters, and just did such a good job. And the conversations that they have feel like I'm peeking into what these characters would really say to one another if they were real. And the hardships that these three men have gone through. There are certain events that occurred in the past back in Vietnam with these three men, and there's nothing that explicitly tells us what exactly happened, even though it is implied, the events that happened, but they just feel so real. These characters all went through those situations. I truly believe that, and that's such an achievement for this movie to have. It's such an impactful story. It's one of the most impactful of the year. It's about how to deal with loss. It's about rekindling old friendships. There's so many different elements at work in this movie, and I would recommend this to everyone. I think that this is such a great movie. There's only one problem that I have with it, and that's with it. I think it went on just a little bit too long. I think that maybe 10 minutes could have been cut off. But other than that, this is an excellent movie, and I would recommend this to absolutely everybody. Really, this is just such a good movie. And I'm going to give Last Flag Flying a 19 out of 20. This is, like, the only problem I have is that it went on a little bit too long. Other than that, this really just is such a pleasant story to watch. And I'm very glad that I saw this movie. And the final movie that I'm going to be reviewing today is Lady Bird. This is written and directed by Greta Gerwig, and it is a teenage girl coming-of-age story. And this is the highest-rated movie on Rotten Tomatoes right now. So I had expectations for this movie, for sure. I tried to lower them as much as possible. I try doing that for every movie, just so I am not disappointed as much. But the thing with this movie is that it's maintained, as of me recording this, it has 180 reviews and has maintained a 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, obviously, not everybody's giving it a 100%. That's not how Rotten Tomatoes works. But everybody seems to think this movie is at least good. And, you know, for the most part, I would say that they're right. This is... I don't know if I would go as far as to say that this is a good movie, though. And the reason that I think that is because there's nothing particularly special about the events that happen in this movie. There's a story in here. It's been done before, the teenage girl coming of age thing. We've seen it before. I've seen it done better. Particularly, just the most recent example is In the Edge of 17 from last year. I think that was a better teenage girl coming of age type movie in several different ways. But the story, the plot in this movie, the events that actually occur, are things that you've seen before. They feel very cliche. Most of what happens is quite predictable. Every once in a while there was something that I knew would happen, but it happened in a way that I didn't expect. So in that way, it surprised me just a little bit, but I still went from A to B. I might have gone there in a different way, but I knew that I was going to get there. So, this movie really didn't do anything for me. It's not a bad movie by any means. I wouldn't call this a bad movie at all. I just think that this definitely is not a movie for me, though. If you are a teenage girl or a young woman, and you have a mother, I would recommend seeing this movie. If you are a mother and you have a teenage daughter or a daughter in her early 20s, I think that you would gain something from this movie. This is a story that might feel very applicable to you, and I would recommend seeing it if you're in that demographic. I'm not in that demographic, so this movie, not only did it not feel like it was made for me, which I don't always have a problem with. I mentioned The Edge of 17 from last year. That movie was not made specifically tailored to me, but I enjoyed it much more because there was more that I could gain from it. It was a better story that I could connect to better. There were more characters in it that felt fleshed out and real. In this movie, the two leading ladies, Lady Bird, as she chooses to call herself, her real name is Christine, and her mother. Both of those characters are good. They have, they're both fully realized, I would say. And the parts that I enjoyed the best about this movie were the parts that included the two of them interacting with one another. I thought that that's where this movie was its strongest. That's where the story really connected with me. Not even connected with me. It felt as though there was a really good story to tell there about a mother-daughter relationship. But the problem was that seems to take a back seat to all of the events happening in Lady Bird's senior year. She's in a religious high school. She doesn't want to go to a religious college. Her mom doesn't want her to go to an East Coast school, even though she wants to go to an East Coast school. There are a lot of different things working in her life, but none of them felt compelling, and none of them were made to feel compelling to me. So this movie, it came across as a little bit boring to me, quite frankly. And it is a short movie. It's 93 minutes long. It did not feel like it was 93 minutes. It felt much longer than that. It's an exaggeration to say that it felt 2 hours long, but it was kind of close to feeling like that to me. And like I said, this isn't a bad movie. There are things to like about it. The relationship between Lady Bird and her mother, as well as the performances given by the two actresses are very, very good. But that's really all this movie has going for it in my eyes. There are a few other things that I enjoyed in this movie. There were some good moments scattered throughout. I thought that Lucas Hedges, while he doesn't exactly give an amazing performance or anything, there was one moment in particular that I thought he did a very good job in, and that was one of the more impactful moments of the movie for me. It was a little too predictable. It was a little too cliched, and there really wasn't anything to interest me in this movie other than the story between Lady Bird and her mother. And like I said before, that takes a back seat to Lady Bird's life, which I didn't find interesting. She doesn't come off as an interesting character to me. So I'm going to give Lady Bird a 12 out of 20. This is not a bad movie. I would say that this is fine. It's not anything special like I was led to believe that it would be. This is just a fine movie. And so those are the 4 most recent movies that I have seen. I plan on seeing more movies, and so you're going to have more reviews just like this one coming out very soon. If you've seen any of these movies, let me know what you think down in the comments section below. I'm curious on what other people think of them. Thank you so much for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.